call them illustrious panel.
Sorry.
You'll have noticed, everyone, that the meeting's now being recorded. I hope everybody's all right with that. So thank you to our wonderful and illustrious panel for finding the time to be with us this evening. We've just clocked in now at 106 participants, so lots of people here this evening, and that's good because I really want to get the word out. Thank you very much to Anthea for helping me to arrange this, for providing the platform and for providing the kind of quality citizen journalism that I think this country needs. So special thanks to Anthea. I'll just kick this off by saying I was fortunate to be one of the very first people. I was in the first cohort of people to be allowed to vote at 18. So I've been voting for a long time. And I have in that time taken part in, I counted them up this afternoon, 13 general elections. And goodness only knows how many local and district and county council elections. And in all that time, I can honestly say, hand on heart, I have never actually voted for a winning candidate. Now, I find that shocking. I find that personally shocking, but I know that I'm not alone in being in that position. And just recently, we've had local elections here in Devon, along with much of the country, where we saw the Conservatives winning 42.5% of the vote, with which they managed to claim 65% of the seats on our county council. So this is a problem that runs up and down the country. And for me, this has got nothing to do with party politics really at all. This is about fundamental democratic rights of us as citizens of this country, to be represented both in local and in national government and to have our voices heard. So I don't think this is about party politics. It's about what's fair and what's right. So without saying any more, I think time to pass over to the panel. And I'm going to go back to you, Anthea, because you knew which order we were going to take them in, and I will allow them to introduce themselves, but thank you again, panel, for being here.
Thank you very much, Rick, and thank you again. Yes, we agreed to go in alphabetical order of surname, so Tom is up first. Thank you, Tom.
Great, thank you, Anthea. And I've got your last phrase, I think, ringing in my ears, which is all politicians are liars, because of course I had 30 years in politics before becoming the director of Unlock Democracy. I had a spell as a councillor in Hackney, I had a spell as a councillor in Sutton, and then I was the Member of Parliament for Carshalton and Wallington for over 20 years. So I like to think of myself not as a liar, but more of that may emerge in this session. And one thing that I should also mention is that in the coalition government, I was a government minister. So I know that potentially quite a lot of the questions that are going to follow are going to be around alliances. And obviously I have hands-on experience of an alliance, but perhaps not quite the alliance that people on this audience are potentially thinking of in terms of what happens after a general election. So very briefly, Unlock Democracy. Many of you will know Unlock Democracy much better as Charter 88. That is what we used to be. And following merger with other organisations, we became Unlock Democracy. So Charter 88's agenda, which was set up in 1988, was at that point to try to secure a written constitution for the United Kingdom, along with associated sort of democratic reforms. And whilst some of Charter 88's agenda was delivered in terms of the devolutionary changes that happened in the Labour government after 1997, so Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, bringing back a mayor in London, unfortunately, other aspects of those democratic reforms, such as proportional representation, didn't happen. And I wish that it had been otherwise, and we wouldn't be in the position that we are in now. So Unlock Democracy campaigns on securing a written constitution, really as the guarantee or an insurance policy that other things that we want to achieve, such as a fair voting system, such as devolution, are things that then a future government on a simple majority can't change, that it would require a 2/3 majority to change some of the fundamental values or principles that as a country, I think we should adopt and Unlock Democracy campaigns for, and many people on this call are committed to. So our brief is much wider than electoral reform. So we campaign also on transparency and accountability issues. We campaign on devolution. And on that front, we commissioned some research, which we published in April, which looked at how local government powers have been eroded over the last 40 years. So we campaign across a broad range of issues, and I'm sure we'll touch on many of those. I don't think it's fair to say that our democracy is broken. After all, we are not Belarus, but clearly our democracy is fragile. There is no doubt about that, and it is fragile in a number of respects, and I hope we might have time to talk about this. For instance, our institutions are under great pressure. Our electoral system, or the integrity of our electoral systems, are under pressure. Freedom of speech and assembly is under pressure, and indeed accountability. And under that heading, I include things like the ministerial code and indeed freedom of information. All of those things are areas where our democracy is fragile. And I'm sure that collectively, both as individuals and as organizations that many of us are part of, we want to try to protect. And I hope that during the course of the discussion, we will find ways in which we can do that. So thank you, Anthea, for giving me a chance to say a few words at the beginning.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'll turn to Klina now, please.
Thank you, Anthea. Yeah, thanks very much for organising this, Anthea and Rick and West Country Bylines. It's great to be here with such friends as well. I just want to agree with Tom that I don't think our democracy is broken, but my view is that we don't yet have real democracy. So I'll get onto that in a minute. I'm a co-founder and co-chief executive at Make Votes Matter, which is the spearheads the national movement for proportional representation, working in collaboration with all sorts of allies like those on this call, on the panel, and many in the audience as well. With grassroots activists to lots of democracy organisations, to parliamentarians and party leaders. So it's kind of across the whole breadth. And yeah, we were delighted to see Dominic Cummings today talking about the elephant in the room, which to us is the voting system. That's like, it's the thing that lies underneath everything to do with our democracy, that without changing that, we're not going to be able to sort out the other things. And so for us at Make Votes Matter, that's very much like the keystone around which we can make the other democratic changes, which are so urgently needed. So we're a single issue campaign for that, for equal votes. So I'd like to start on the topic of not having real democracy with the fact that the word democracy comes from the Greek demos and kratos, which is the people and power. And the people clearly are not in power when 71% of votes are wasted, as they were at the 2019 general election. And when you can have wrong winner elections, which we've had a couple times in the last century, once with the Tories winning when Labour had more votes and one time the other way round. There are all sorts of other awful things about first past the post, which I'm sure many of you know about, but I won't go into all of the detail because I imagine I'll be speaking to the converted. What it is probably worth saying is that other countries like that have first past the post mainly have it because they were unfortunately ex-colonies of the UK, and so we've given them this horrible colonial export of a voting system, which means that they don't really get to choose their governments. And most democracies already use forms of PR, and as a consequence they enjoy better social, environmental and economic outcomes. And this isn't just my opinion, this is kind of based on decades of political science research from around the world. So there's kind of really tangible things that are different in these what I call real democracies. So I am involved in this because of my passion about the environment and the climate crisis, and we basically have 10 years to turn things around at most. and that's again according to the science. And we know that countries with PR have better environmental legislation, they take faster action on the climate crisis, and so on. So this is urgent, and it's kind of a matter of life and death for me. In terms of how we plan to bring about this change, we've got 3 strands to our campaign. There's the grassroots, Labour and Alliance. So I'll talk very briefly about each of those. The grassroots includes all sorts of activity like petitions, letters. We've got local groups around the country. One of like the most awesome and active ones is in Totnes, led by Laurie, and there's other members in this call, which is great. We do parliamentary lobbies, action days. So on one occasion we did an event called Hungry for Democracy, which was actually marking the centenary of some women getting the vote for the first time. And so it's a 24-hour fast, which got a lot of media coverage. Our next one's going to be called Make Some Noise, and that's going to be on the 17th of July, which also happens to be on a date which is relevant to how many people are actually represented by the MPs that they chose. So there's a certain point in the year after which, if you convert voters to days of the year and percentages, after that point in the year, people aren't represented by the person they chose, and that's the 17th of July. So we're inviting people to make noise in whatever way they want to. That might be singing, it might be going and banging pots and pans at their local council and saying they want PR locally. It might be a brass band. We invite people to kind of bring in all their creativity for that. So the next part, the next strand is the Labour part of the campaign, and to that end we're working with a coalition of other organisations in Labour for a New Democracy, so lots of motions have been raised by constituency Labour parties, over a third of them in total, and I think it's 97% of CLPs that have debated PR have actually passed motions for it. So it's a very kind of tiny number that are not then passing motions when they have the debate. And we're planning to take this to the party conference this year, and there's even been some movement around the unions recently, and there's about a third of the PLP, the Parliamentary Labour Party, on board as well. So that's actually looking quite positive, and we clearly need one of the 2 big parties on board. Then the third strand is the Alliance. As I said, there's many of you in the room. One of the latest additions is Emma Kennedy, who's an illustrious actress. And I'm currently talking to Emma Best, who's a new Conservative London Assembly member, who's pro-PR. And so hopefully we'll get her into the Alliance as well. So it's not all progressives that are for this change, it's across the full spectrum. A key thing about the Alliance, a big achievement, was in 2019. We launched the Good Systems Agreement, which was signed off by all of the opposition parties aside from Labour. And it basically sets out the principles of good voting systems. And so it's kind of distilled down a lot of political science information about this, and it sets out the kind of the key principles. But it also says that the best way to choose the voting system for the UK would be through a citizen-led deliberative process, like a citizens' assembly, so that you don't end up having MPs choose a voting system, which they might have some kind of personal interest in. So that's the kind of the brief summary of how our campaign works. And ultimately what we're aiming for is to get a government that will legislate for PR and hopefully for a citizen-led process to choose the voting system. So yeah, I look forward to talking with you all more about how we do that.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn to Molly.
Thank you very much, Anthea. Thanks to everybody for being here. So I'm a Green Party person, and I'm involved in these discussions inside the party. And I was a Unite to Remain candidate in the election in December 2019. And Unite to Remain was actually a national alliance along the lines many people are talking about now, where candidates stood aside for other candidates to have a crack at the Tories. And it worked as a proof of concept. It didn't work because Labour didn't come on board. And if Labour had come on board, we wouldn't have this government and we wouldn't have Brexit either. So to me, there's huge potential in that idea, but I'm also incredibly disappointed that Labour didn't get involved, and I think our objective now is to make sure that they will get involved for a similar arrangement for the next general election. So I was elected as MEP for the South West under a proportional electoral system by a very slim margin, I have to say. And I was really sort of moved, but also rather sad by the number of people that emailed me afterwards to say that was the first time their vote had ever counted. And as people here have said, you know, some of those people were in their 60s or 70s, and that's just absolutely shocking. And it wouldn't happen in a proper modern European democracy where you actually have a fair choice between parties and you can choose the party that you actually prefer, and then you can be pretty sure that somebody will represent you from that party. So as an MEP, I did quite a lot of work looking at fascism and how it was on the rise across the world and how it was on the rise in the UK. And that was a sort of a cause and a consequence of Brexit. In the normal rules of democracy were abandoned. Data was stolen, people were sent propaganda, there was all sorts of illegal activity, overspending, you know, a whole range of norms that had always protected our democracy were broken. And once the Tories found out they could break those norms, they just went ahead and broke them more. And that's why we've got this government. And if I mean, yeah, I don't take any lessons from Dominic Cummings at all, because he was the person that broke democracy. So if it's broken, then he was he was the person with the hammer, in my view. Although, of course, as Klina said, it never worked very well. We've never had a proper democracy in this country. So I've got a page on my website, which is still there as an archive, called Fight Fascism. And that explains to you why I think this is what we're facing and how I've defined that. And it also gives you lots of ideas about how to counter that. So to me, that's something we all need to commit to in terms of our support for democracy. And I've been really quite worried by the number of people, particularly younger people, but actually people of all ages now, who say, oh, democracy is not going to work. And, you know, we need essentially revolutionary change, or, you know, an extra parliamentary route to change. And that is not something that comes just from the right, it comes from the right and the left now. And so one of the things I'm strongly committed to is defending representative democracy. Of course, it can be enhanced with citizens' assemblies and so on, and it needs to be made fair and representative. But I think we also need to be careful to always make that point, because a lot of people are just abandoning hope in democracy altogether. So I'm going to make the case here, as I make is for a pact along the lines of Unite to Remain, but probably called Unite for Democracy for the next general election. And the reason for that is that the Conservatives are clearly dismantling democracy. They're doing a gerrymandering exercise in the boundary review. They are trying to remove the places where we actually have PR at the moment, such as in the London Assembly. And there's just a range of ways in which they are clearly unpicking even the democracy that we do have. And that means that as Democrats, we need to come together in a popular front to defend democracy. And to me, this isn't about will it be better or worse for Labour. This is because anybody who's a Democrat ought to see the writing on the wall. And that's the primary reason we need to cooperate. Of course, I want a parliament that includes a fair share of Greens, and I'm sure Liberal Democrats feel the same way. But the priority, and this was actually the priority in 2019 as well, is to make sure that we don't have an anti-democratic government, not just an undemocratic government, but an anti-democratic government. And so I think we need to have an arrangement, as we did with Unite to Remain, where we have a fair standing aside in different seats, and an agreed platform of constitutional reform that we're all signed up to. And obviously it's essential that the parliament that's elected after the next general election includes enough people from parties who are already committed to PR that Labour can't govern without them. And that's our sort of guarantee that that Labour won't renege once they get into power, as they did in 1997. So I'm sure we'll be talking more about these issues, but that's kind of my pitch for this evening.
Great, thank you very much. Mary.
Hi, and thank you, Anthea and Rick, for allowing us to agree on so much. I think we might have to have a discussion about where Labour fits in the pact, because that's not 100% Labour Party policy yet. And I'm glad that you've all mentioned organisations that I've worked with or supported or know about, so that I can be completely sectarian and Labour. So I want to talk about what we're doing in the Labour Party. And when I say we, I mean LCR, Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform in the South West. of which I'm the representative on the executive, but by no means the most active activist. And we have spread out to most of the Labour Party constituencies, and we have a few grey areas, and we have wonderful maps that Robin, I think, is on the call. He puts together, and what we've done is to do the obvious thing, which is to get resolutions to conference, which Klina has already talked about. And we have 39 out of our 55 constituencies who have put motions to something called the National Policy Forum, Commission on Justice and Home Affairs, which sounds all very grand, but actually I think the website works quite well. And as soon as you agree anything with any number of people, and you don't have to be Labour to go on the website, you can go on it and say what you think Labour should be doing if you want to. You won't be listened to half as much as Labour people who say it, but it's really important that we take the Labour Party with us in order to effect this change. A National Policy Forum is something which was set up by Neil Kinnock following the Swedish idea of having a sort of perpetual policy discussion, a study group society, I think they call it in Sweden. And I'll go back to LCR Southwest. First of all, we have held meetings with our MPs. So one of our MPs is Luke Pollard, who has got the remit on rural areas and agriculture. And if you're living in a rural area, a Labour vote doesn't count. So what we have to remember when we're talking to Labour is that some people have got the benefit of first past the post, or that so they think, and they see it from that perspective, and they're in Parliament. But people in the Southwest don't see it like that. We don't need a connection with our MP necessarily, especially as only one Liberal Democrat and 6 Labour in the whole region. Whereas that's one of the most important things for somebody from the Northeast. So we need to look at region by region what arguments work. And in the Southwest, it's basically we're underrepresented and we don't deliver on rural policy, and we don't think that those issues are important for winning seats, which they ought to be under a PR system. We've too joined together in Labour for a New Democracy. In fact, LCR is one of the prime movers because we're seeing Labour as it is and trying to get it converted. But we've also, besides dealing with this constituency Labour Party, CLPs, we've created champions in each of those constituencies that we're still minus South Dorset and Poole. And I've been in touch with Claire Moody, who used to be an MEP, and about Salisbury and who we can have on our group from Salisbury. So who are the movers and shakers in the Labour Party? I was lucky enough to work with Robin Cook and Mo Molam, and they've been absent for 15, 16 years. But there are people coming up, as Klina said, a third of the Parliamentary Labour Party are in favour of electoral reform. And one person I want to flag up who's quite important is Nick Thomas Simmons, who reads and writes and thinks, and he's done 2 books, one on Nye Bevan and the other on Clement Attlee, and he's convening this Justice and Home Affairs Commission. It doesn't sound as if it should be dealing with electoral reform, but it actually takes on the remit of the Cabinet Office. And that's just been taken over by Angela Rayner. So we're going to talk to our, deputy leader, as well as our leader, about electoral reform. I mean, she comes from a part of the country where they don't discuss electoral reform. It's never raised with their MP, and that needs to change. Because those are the areas who, I'm not saying they're obstacles, I'm not attacking them, I'm just saying that they don't see what we see because it's so obvious to us in the Southwest. So I just want to go back and say we've had 2 commissions. We've had a referendum which came from the Liberal Democrats, but was also in the Labour Party manifesto. We have done some things on democracy. And when I was talking to Nick Thomas Simmons, I said, I think we need that sort of beverage idea, that ideas can come from outside the Labour Party that we can pick up and run with, but we have got to do something about democracy, as well as the other things which Labour will concentrate on, which are social care, social housing, non-university education, of course, the environment and what's happening with climate change. And the other thing is jobs, which are going to be not available for young people if they're automated, or, you know, if they're not necessary. So some people without qualifications will be surplus to requirements. So without going into the whole of the Labour Party policy, this is crucial. I do believe it changes votes. I think in the crucial margins, which Labour has to win from the Conservatives, we have to appeal to non-Labour, non-Tory voters. And if we can convince them we are really serious about electoral reform, that will make a difference. I think we'll have a general election earlier than we're all saying. As soon as Boris can run to the country, before they discover all these things Dominic Cummings is talking about, I think we'll get the fixed term parliament, which the Liberal Democrats brought in with the Tories. That will be annulled. Then we'll have boundary changes, we'll have voter ID, and voter suppression is really what the Tories are about, and they're ruthless. There are some good Tories, and I think they would come back if we had a PR system, and that would be good. Now, that's only said from a Labour perspective. Okay.
Thank you very much. That's very good. We'll start with a very simple and obvious question, which is from Vicky Seddon, who says, what is the main point that we need to make to non-PR fans? So people who don't understand or are interested in proportional representation, what's the main point we need to land with these people? Who would like to go first? Klina. Thank you.
I think an important thing to realise when you're talking to normal people who aren't already inside the electoral reform bubble is that it's important to make clear that this is about outcomes. It's not about which voting system and the details of the voting systems. It's about the outcomes that actually matter to us. So I'd say start off with finding out about what that person cares most about. And maybe it's about a local school, maybe it's about healthcare, and it might be about theatres being closed. But find out what it's about. And then actually there's almost always a link about better governance, which is linked with having what I call real democracy, having at least a proportional parliament. And there's a lot of evidence around all of that. So my general kind of approach is keep it simple and let people know that if seats match votes, then they're more likely to see the outcomes that they want to from parliamentary decisions.
Just briefly, Anthea, I mean, perhaps also come at it from, we've seen on the chat here that lots of people in this chat have never actually voted for a winning candidate, even though they might have been voting for 50 or 60 or 70 years. Under a PR system, it is very likely that they will have voted for a winning candidate probably in every single election that has taken place. So it's actually about stressing that people's voices are properly heard in a PR system. And the other aspect of PR that we can point to is the fact that the countries that tend to that use PR systems, New Zealand is perhaps the best example, end up with governments that are far more representative of the general population than under a first past the post system. So I think there are two extra things on top of what Klina has stressed that we should be underlining with people who don't support or are agnostic about PR.
Mary.
I think the thing which I've experienced that have changed the Labour Party are talking about marginal seats and how few people in those very few, maybe 88 or 80 seats actually decide the general election, and everybody else has a walk-on part. But we're not in this democracy, and I think that the other point to make is that where you have safe seats, the Labour Party is piling up more and more seats into vote mountains, and those vote mountains don't go anywhere. There's Roy Jenkins started using this word, vote mountains, and I think electoral deserts and vote mountains are two sides of the first past the post coin, and they're both not necessary. We need to get to a PR system.
I'll just quickly chip in, Anthea, to say I agree a lot with Klina. I mean, Dominic Cummings pointed out today, one of the many consequences of this electoral system, you get a choice between bad and worse, right? And that's all people can have. And there's just so many examples of things it causes. The confrontational politics people don't like, you know, the inability to solve problems like social care because there's just one party attacking the other party. So many issues. And what I do on Twitter is like whenever, you know, almost anything that goes wrong is partly caused by our failed electoral system. But I would say we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to make this argument, because this kind of degradation of democracy into a horse race is what we all grow up with. And the sort of, it pushes people to say completely nuts things to you in an election that seem perfectly logical within the insanity of first past the post. And so I think another useful thing to do is to try and take people out of that. Like I had a German guy campaigning with me here, and he was literally shocked. I mean, Germans sort of go white with horror when they realize how people are making the decision, which is who can win, not who do I want to vote for, but who can win. And I think trying to convey to people that actually a democracy is about choosing who you prefer, not trying to make some kind of absurd, you know, mind screwing calculation about who might be able to win in your seat. That whole pressure should be taken away from them. But I would say finally that the people we need to persuade are the Labour voters, particularly the Labour voters and the Labour Party. And for them, the argument is they simply won't win. Labour will never win again under first past the post. So if Labour want to have power again, or if voters want Labour to have power, then they must shift towards a fair voting system, because the combination of Scotland, Labour losing its seats in Scotland, and the boundary review that the Tories are bringing in, and the general voter suppression and all the things that we know are going wrong with democracy, the Tories are using them more and more. And unless we save democracy now, it's really hard to see how we're going to be able to do that at any point, because it's going to get harder each time the Tories come in and take away more of our democratic rights.
Thank you. That was yeah. Mary, yes, you wanted to come in on that.
I just want to come in on that because telling Labour it can never win again is not the winning argument to the Labour Party. Telling them that they have more of a chance if they adopt electoral reform is quite a winning argument, even for the trade unions. So I think you just have to be careful how you use that. And I know it's much easier for Labour to get a Labour-led government than it is to get into a majority Labour government. And Scotland, there's no coming back in Scotland unless we can win Westminster. So I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think that's the way to start with Labour voters. You can never win again, so you have to go for PR, because how are we going to transition from first past the post if we don't get a Labour-led government?
Right, thank you.
Perhaps I should be clear. I mean that there will never be a Labour government on its own. I agree with you, Mary.
Okay.
We have to achieve a Labour-led government, but I think this is one of the blocks we've got, that unfortunately a lot of Labour politicians and a lot of Labour voters simply are living in a delusional space where if they just try a little bit harder next time, they'll win. We've had 4 elections now where unfortunately, we've all suffered from the fact that. So, I mean, I am being brutal now, and I agree with you, one would have to be more subtle, but nonetheless, until Labour accepts that they will not have this absolute power and sole government again, I don't think we're going to get the shift we need. So that's the change. I mean, Labour will be in power most of the time, but they will be sharing that power. That's the world I think we'll be moving to when we get PR.
Thank you. I was just going to make an observation for what it's worth, that I also worry that for quite a vast swathe of the population that does vote, the older population, voting Tory is somehow aspirational. You know, it's got something attached to it that says I've arrived and I can afford to be voting Conservative. And I think that's another, anyway, that's a whole other issue. Got a very interesting observation here and question from Lucy Trinder, and it feeds into a number of other questions about the idea of primaries possibly ahead of a progressive alliance. What do the panelists think of holding an opinion poll of progressive candidates in each constituency before the next general election or by-election? Well prepared, it would kick off automatically once a general by-election is called. It would be a one-off event, so it wouldn't need to happen at every election or by-election. The candidate with the most votes would get the sort of the people's vote, as it were, and would then stand against the Conservative candidate and or any other candidate who doesn't want to include electoral reform in their manifesto pledges. And the subject matters would include environmental topics, education, health policies, etc. So the best candidate that the local people feel to represent them will be the one selected to go forward, and all other candidates will step aside. I don't know, what do you think of that as a suggestion? Tom?
Well, I think there's a stage before that, which is there needs to be an agreement, which probably is going to be at a local level in individual constituencies. I think it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve a progressive alliance in advance of a general election that is agreed at a national level between the different political parties, the centre left and left parties. So I think it's going to be down to local agreements, and those local agreements might not actually involve a party standing a candidate down, for instance. That local agreement might simply involve a party agreeing that its candidate is going to be simply a paper candidate whose name will appear, but beyond that, nothing else is going to happen. For instance, if it had been possible to come to an arrangement in the constituency that I used to represent, which I lost after 22 years by 600 votes, when the Labour Party again came third with 6,000 votes, then the outcome there would have been different. So I think we have to understand that these arrangements are going to be potentially quite informal, quite localized, and then it might be possible that in a particular constituency, the Green Party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, and possibly if you're in a nationalist area, that doesn't seem very likely in Wales or Scotland, perhaps the national candidate there might, or the Nationalist Party candidate might not stand either, that you might be able to get an agreement of the type that Lucy has set out, with a primary where the candidates from the different parties, the progressive parties, would agree that whoever came top of the polls would then go forward to represent all of those parties. But it's going to have to be negotiated, I suspect, at a local level.
Molly, did you want to add?
Yeah,
sorry, did you want to add? Yeah.
Just to say, one of the things that's rather weird about our political system is that it works as if it's the people that matter, but actually it's the parties that matter. So our political system is run by the parties and they choose the candidates, but then the candidates portray themselves as like the local person. And so there's a sort of confusion in people's minds about what they're voting for. In fact, research shows that only 6% of people know who the candidate is, but nonetheless, we have this, especially we who are more interested in politics, have this conception that we're voting for the best person. So in primaries, it will become sort of random in terms of which party was elected. And that might really matter because somebody might portray themselves in the primary as, okay, I won't say what happened here, but somebody might portray themselves as a person who supports, let's say, incredibly ambitious targets on climate change, but then they go along and take the whip of a party that doesn't support that. So So I think to have primaries, you'd have to have a sort of constitutional settlement where actually what mattered was the people themselves rather than the parties they're going to become a part of. And that's something we have to accept if we move towards a PR system, especially if it's a list system, that parties will put forward lists rather than people being able to choose candidates. And of course you can have a list, oh, I'm doing that technical talking about electoral systems, but you can have a thing where people prioritize the candidates, and you could have something where you have constitutional seats and top up as they do in Scotland and Wales. But I think this is one of the questions that people really need to think through. You can't just sort of have a personality contest between different candidates and then say, oh, as it happens, it's all the Green candidates that people like best, because why would Labour put up with that? I'm just saying it that way around. It equally works the other way around as well. But there's a technical issue here as well, which is that if you ran more money, would have more money to invest in those primaries and they win more. So it wouldn't be a fair fight, I would say, if you run primaries. So that's another reason I don't like them very much.
Anybody else want to come in on that, Klina?
Thank you. So I have to start off by saying that Make Votes Matter doesn't have a position on electoral cooperation because we're a single issue campaign for PR. But my personal view is that we're not going to get PR without some kind of electoral cooperation. And I think Tom's absolutely right that it has to be decided locally. I think it's not going to work unless there's at least some kind of conversation and cooperation between the parties at the senior levels as well. But that doesn't necessarily look like a big national announcement, and there might be reasons why that wouldn't work. But there are all sorts of ways that you can do kind of local cooperation to figure out gaming the system just the one time to make sure that we get a government that will bring in proportional representation, and then you don't ever have to do it again. Just another point on this, I think it's dangerous to talk about progressive alliances. I think the word progressive means different things to different people and can be quite divisive. And as a cross-party campaign, I think we mustn't forget about those who don't call themselves progressives as well. And I think we're going to need everybody who wants PR to bring this change about, not just progressives. So let's kind of keep a bit open-minded and try to live the future democracy that we want to see, which is about cooperation. It's about kind of more consensus and listening to each other so that we can work together to make the changes that need to happen.
Great, thank you. Mary, you're on mute. Yeah.
Yes. Hi. I don't know whether this is the main part where we discuss about PACs, but I did some work in the Southwest looking at the targets which Labour has and the targets which the Liberal Democrats have, and didn't look at the targets because it probably would be my seat again, Molly, Bristol West. But the lists don't overlap except in two places, and one of them is the seat held by the Leader of the House, Rees-Mogg, and the other is down in Totnes. And I don't know that's what happened with Sarah Woolacott, but I think she was an admirable MP. You know, what she did in the Southwest, the issues she took up were really good. And that was from a primary, but it didn't take her through as soon as she didn't have the Tory support. So I worry about primaries. I think it sounds a bit American for me.
Just to distinguish between primaries where different parties compete, which is what I was criticising, and an internal primary, which is what brought Sarah Wollaston in Totnes. So those, obviously, they're different kind of issues there.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, on that, just on the PACT thing, got a question sent in advance from Rob Bygrave. We've got to break the current electoral system and we need radical action to do this. I've been a Labour member for 40 years, former PPC in West Dorset, local council for 24 years, and I now think it's time to change. The UK desperately needs a progressive, but we'll get part of that word for a minute, the government, and we should follow the example of France, which elected Macron last time, who's not my favourite, but they formed a pact to keep out Le Pen. My suggestion is that a formal pact legally binding is made with all non-Conservative parties in the next few months. It will last until 12 months after the next election. All the pact members would then each stand down in areas where other parties are more likely to win, which we discussed. The pact would mean that having removed the Tories, the temporary government will bring in an agreed form of PR. This will now be used in another election within 12 months to form the new parliament. How likely? And another Sarah, whose surname I haven't got, said, how can the we keep using this word progressive, right, opposition to the Conservative Party and supporters of democracy be persuaded to work together? I mean, we sort of call it, but I think people need to know more about that.
Well, I mean, I've talked about this already. It's actually very, very difficult to arrange. It's easy to write that on paper, but getting the parties to negotiate and agree, and people, actually, particularly people that might be in a job and saying, well, I'm sorry, you know, for example, in Bristol, Mary, you know, I feel it's well overdue time that Bristol did have a Green MP, but I totally respect the fact that there's 4 Labour people there with jobs and they don't want to give up their jobs. So, you know, that's very hard to negotiate. I think we need to face the facts about how difficult all of this is, and also how long it will take to get the legislation through, changing the electoral system, even if the government has a clear majority. And if we follow the route that Klina suggests of having a citizens' convention to choose the best form of PR, which I think I agree is the best system, best route, then that takes even longer, obviously. But to me, the crucial thing is that we get the arrangement, and I think it needs to be standing aside, because the paper candidate thing, local activists, you know, they will get over enthusiastic, and it won't be clear to electors who they should be voting for. So I think we need to have Tories plus a pro-democracy candidate in as many places as possible, enough to get a majority. And they need to be standing on a clear platform of constitutional reform, and then they will have the mandate to introduce that after the election, instead of having to have a referendum, because, you know, we know that the Tories are capable of corrupting any referendum, as we've seen previously. And what the Tories did is they put the electoral changes they wanted to make, like the boundary review and the voter suppression, so they put it in their manifesto. They send out the clown wins, then all the democracy gets dismantled. You know, why are we being so why are we pussyfooting around when what we're trying to do is save that democracy? So I think, you know, if we all the 3 parties need to sign up to a clear platform of constitutional reform, then we have a mandate to introduce that. Yeah, the exact choice of system probably do leave to a citizens' assembly. I'm not sure I entirely answered the question, but anyway, you can see that's my plan. But I just need to put a caveat saying it was incredibly difficult to get the Unite to Remain pact last time, and I think that was 50 seats. And this time, if Labour come on board, you know, it's going to be that much more complicated, because they have a lot more jobs they're protecting than either Tom's party or mine.
Thank you. Anybody? Yes, Klina.
Thank you. I'd just like to mention, is we're talking about 3 parties, but I think we also need to consider Plaid Cymru and the SNP, at least for some of this. But in terms of how do we convince people about electoral cooperation, I think it's going to be very hard to convince people, and it's going to need to happen both from the top of the parties down and from the local people up. And I think we might actually need a national programme of mediators to help bring about the conversations that need to happen locally, because there are such entrenched tribal feelings, and like a lot of that's really understandable, like where candidates have stood against each other. And like I've just been hearing horror stories about somebody who volunteers with us standing as a councillor recently, and then just getting a whole load of abuse afterwards, because people saying that she should have stood aside. And so yeah, it's going to be difficult because people remember these things, but I think we need to try to make that happen anyway. But what I can say very confidently is that a key part of how we make the case is to have people really believing in the need for electoral reform, for equal votes. And we already know that all of the opposition parties, aside from Labour, already support. So the key bit is Labour. So I would encourage everyone here who is in the Labour Party to raise motions to conference which need to happen quite soon. And Mary, you can probably correct me, but I think it's like quite early in June, the deadline for that. So do raise motions from your CLPs calling for Labour to back or support PR.
Shall I come in and answer that?
Yes, Mary.
Okay. Basically, the timetable for Labour Party conference, which we hope will be real and not virtual, is that you have to have resolutions, motions in by the 13th of September. Now, the sooner you get your constituency to discuss them, the less likely there is to be opposition, because there will be lots of other good ideas, you know, against violence against women and girls. It's already emerging as a key one, and there's, you know, there are other factors, but we need to choose on the voting system, because this divides the Labour Party, whereas I don't think anybody's in favour of violence against women and girls. So that's if we can possibly get the resolutions through constituencies before the National Policy Forum, which meets in July, then we have a good chance of the discussion going also via the National Policy Forum and not just to conference. And I just want to say that I worked with Robin Cook, and there was something called the Cook-McClellan Commission. I don't know exactly what it was called, but where they agreed overlapping actions on democracy, on devolution, on a referendum, on electoral reform. Not that we had one, but that agreement changed the dynamic. So it allowed people to tactically vote, knowing that if they were Liberal Democrat and voted Labour, they in the key seats, they would get the same result as somebody else, you know, Labour voting, you know, what did I say? Liberal Democrat voting Labour. So the Cook-McClellan process should be looked at as a way of widening out to the Green Party and probably Plaid and maybe the SNP, although they're really focused totally on independence. So they have a different sort of take on a non-aggression treaty between parties. So it's no point having a Liberal Democrat leader who attacks Jeremy Corbyn all the time, and without thinking that that has an effect on the Labour Party. It was a real downer you lost all your tactical vote. First of all, by going to coalition. This is to Tom, but I know he's not the representative of Liberal Democrat here, but they lost the tactical vote in 2010 and were just picking it up when they chose a leader who decided, for whatever reason, that she was just going to attack Jeremy Corbyn. And I think she'd been advised by Cheka Amuna, who'd left the Labour Party and really wasn't reading the Labour Party in a neutral way. So attacking Labour is off the agenda if we want to get a Labour-led government, and attacking third parties and Liberal Democrats and Greens is also off the agenda. I mean, we shouldn't be doing it. If we want to get a non-Tory government, we've got to stop attacking each other, find common causes, common overlapping policies, and, you know, work together. I don't think it has to be a formal pact, is what I'm saying.
Yes, I'm not going to respond to Mary's comments about Liberal Democrats, as I'm here as the director of Unlock Democracy, but
Exactly,
so not my role any longer. Just on President Macron, I'm not sure whether, certainly at the first round of the French presidential elections, there wasn't any agreement at all. I think whether there was in the second round, I can't remember, but clearly the French people, fortunately, when they were confronted with either President Macron or Le Pen, came to the right conclusion. In relation to what Molly said, yes, absolutely, the progressive parties need to, and picking up on Klina's point, perhaps even some of the parties that we wouldn't describe as progressive, need to have democratic reform in their sort of manifestos, because if we arrive at a situation where there is no party with a majority after the next general election, then having a common platform agreed around democratic reform issues will facilitate a process of conversation. The arrangements, I still think, need to be informal. The problem with trying to do anything formal in terms of an alliance before a general election is that in many of the seats that the Liberal Democrats would want to win, where they are in contention with the Conservatives, an alliance with the Labour Party will be portrayed. You remember how effective the Conservative campaign was in highlighting links between Labour and the SNP, which didn't even exist. So if we're actually talking about a formal alliance, then we can anticipate what that campaign from the Conservatives will look like. And that's why I think it has to be more informal, but it will clearly be helped by having areas where there has been agreement reached, not necessarily agreement where the parties have sat down in the same room and agreed a common platform, but an agreement that might have been reached where each party has adopted a very similar policy in relation to democratic reforms. And just so that people know, I mean, we as an organisation working with Compass have just put in a bid, we don't know whether it will be successful or not, to secure funding to try to promote the idea of democratic reforms more widely across the progressive parties, to try to create a common platform which would enable that dialogue to happen much more easily in the aftermath of an election where no party won overall control.
Thank you very much. I think it was quite interesting in the last election that with our other hat on as Devon for Europe, we really tried to persuade people to vote swap where they could, where there was no, frustration at the lack of an alliance in every seat. But I think as an apolitical but non-party political person, I think that probably lots of people on the call despair when they hear anything that sort of refers to tribalism, because this is the thing that's an enemy to us, of those of us who just want our voices heard. And I think tribalism is it's been one of the greatest obstacles to progress in electoral reform. I've got a question here that takes us in a slightly different direction for a moment. Given the extent of lobbying of politicians and public opinion manipulation by various sources, this is from Piers Maddox, by the way, perhaps it's naive to focus on the single issue of PR. Wouldn't it make more sense to broaden the Make Votes Matter agenda, and any campaigner for reform agenda, to include the need to address lobbying, media control, party funding, and second chamber reform, and consultative democracy reforms? Otherwise, you risk wasting energy and raising false hope. Klina.
Considering that's addressed to Make Votes Matter, I'll start on that and think the answer is very simple. As I was saying, I think that bringing in proportional representation is the keystone to bringing about the other democratic changes that we need to see. The democracy sector, as much as it's a sector, is kind of an ecosystem of organisations that have different focuses. So there are organisations focusing on those things. So Unlock Democracy does a lot of that. The Electoral Reform Society does a lot of that. Compass, for example, leads on a lot of the Progressive Alliance work, and they very much call it Progressive Alliance. So I'll call it that there. I'd also like to give a shout out to the Forward Democracy guys, who are brilliant, and they're talking about firing up Swap My Vote for the upcoming by-elections, but I'm kind of digressing a little bit here. The point is there are people looking after these things, and so we'll stay focused on PR because we think it's crucial, and I imagine Tom would probably like to come in on the bits that they actually do deal with.
Thank you for the intro, Klina. Indeed, so Unlock Democracy as an organisation, we do campaign across a wider platform. I guess all of the organisations in the democracy sector have to make choices about what they choose to prioritise. And in fact, we as an organisation, our ultimate objective is a written constitution, but we had 6 campaign strands that we try to work on to help deliver the written constitution, which include transparency, accountability, devolution, deliberative democracy, human rights, and electoral reform. But we as an organisation have recently come to the conclusion that even that reach is too large for us as an organisation, and therefore we are focusing on the areas of transparency, accountability, and devolution, because we believe we are large enough as an organisation to make a difference in that field. And instead, we will support Make Votes Matter, Electoral Reform Society, when they're campaigning on things to do with electoral reform. We will support organisations like the Sortition Foundation and Involve when they're campaigning on things to do with deliberative democracy. So we're trying to, both us as an organisation and as a sector, and I welcome very much the fact that Joseph Rowntree have funded a democracy network, the idea being to try to ensure that we're not overlapping, that we are sharing resources, we're sharing expertise, so that we can try to punch above our weight. Perhaps not a very good analogy for me to use, but you know, to ensure that we are more effective together, as opposed to dissipating a lot of our energy by simply replicating something that another organisation in the sector is already doing.
Thank you, Mary.
A
Sorry,
lot of the people in the Labour campaign for electoral reform were also, when it started, in Charter 88. And we found that the Charter 88 agenda was used against the people who wanted electoral reform. And we were saying, you can't have one without the other. So I think that, yes, we need to talk about more. And the Labour campaign for electoral reform would support a move for local government PR, like they have the choice to have in Wales, and they already have in Scotland. I think we would like to see an elected House of Lords or Senate, and so there are widenings of the voting system, which Make Votes Matter sees concentrating. Well, obviously this year we're concentrating on the way we elect MPs. I just want to say something about the 2 by-elections, because already I've heard people say that Labour should withdraw in Chesham and Amersham, and vice versa in Batley and Spence. And I wanted to say that I've met Jo Cox's sister, and I'm really pleased that the Labour Party has adopted her, not just because she probably deserved it, because she came into politics from being very shy and not knowing a lot, and she's done a lot through the fact that her sister was killed for democracy, I would say. And I think I heard Layla Moran, Liberal Democrat, saying that it's not a binary choice. So if the Liberal Democrats withdrew in Batley and Spence, then some of the wet Tories wouldn't vote for them and would vote for the Tories, and therefore wouldn't switch to Labour. And therefore it's a calculation you can't make. You can't dictate how your voters are going to vote by withdrawing candidates, my view.
That's definitely true, but there are many seats, like for example Cheltenham, where if Labour hadn't stood last time, I mean the Lib Dems were very close to winning that, and there were probably enough seats across the country where that would have made the difference, and we wouldn't have had Brexit and we wouldn't have had this government. That's why I worked hard for Unite to Reform. I mean, I seem to be here in a rather anomalous position of actually just being a Green Party person. So just to say, obviously, I completely agree with the comments that were made about the need to reform the way our media works. There's so much wrong with our democracy. I wrote a paper recently, there was a PACAC. Somebody probably knows what PACAC stands for, I'm sure Tom does. It's the I think last time I was on the call, you reminded me what it stands for. It's a parliamentary committee that's looking into constitutional reform, but obviously from a Tory point of view, which means undermining democracy. But I put in a very lengthy submission to that included all these issues, which I'm very happy to share later if that would be useful to people. And I'm sure other political parties have done the same. So we say maximum 20% of media platforms owned by one person, and nobody can own any media platform or outlet unless they're resident here and paying taxes here. So that would make almost all our media outlets up for grabs immediately, which would be quite interesting.
Right, and that could make a big difference to voter engagement for sure. On that sort of tack about voter engagement, I've got a more uplifting comment and question from Prana Simon, who's talking about how important it is to give us citizens training in organising to pressurize for change, for change. And she's written here, so many more non-voters would have to latch onto the idea of democracy actually being exciting to get them to show up. Like Joe Biden does, you need a narrative that only democracy is going to make the world a better place. Rather than harp on about the car crash that's about to happen with global collapse, let's offer up a refreshed version of democratic action, on the ground action like Black Votes Matter, taking Georgia over to a Democrat line in both the national and special elections. Without that, deprived voters coming out in droves because of the promise of change, the USA would have been sunk. And I personally have written to Stacey Abrams, and actually I asked her if she'd come on this call. I didn't have a reply, but it seems that we do need somebody inspirational, some big names and some real motivational power to get people engaged with this. And I just wonder what you feel about that. And Prana Simon definitely wants to know. Tom.
Prana's question is a very good one. I think it's perhaps one of the most challenging questions to answer in terms of how does the democracy sector and the organisations that campaign in it create a narrative that goes beyond the 100 people who are on this call, the 200 or 300 who might be on a call with Will Hutton that we're hosting tomorrow, so that we are speaking to people who are not engaged in these issues. And I have to confess that, I've been in post since October as director of Unlock Democracy, and this is probably still the one big challenge that I feel I haven't yet resolved in terms of creating the sort of narrative that will work in Wallington High Street, my local high street, on a Saturday morning. So we've got to find ways of putting it across and making it relevant. And you can try, and this work is happening. So the Sortition Foundation have been hosting some events where we've been trying to do this, to find ways of making the linkages as linking the sort of things that we are working on, that we're campaigning on, trying to deliver, with things that people are perhaps more attuned to in their daily lives, with what's happening in the health service, with what's happening in education. But it's hard to do that. So maybe there are people on this call who've got the solutions or who've got some ideas, and I would certainly welcome them, because I don't think that we're there yet in terms of having the right phrases, the right our own sort of homegrown messages that are as effective as Take Back Control. Maybe Make Votes Matter is one of those that is as effective as Take Back Control, but there aren't many of the messages of that nature that are as effective.
Thank you. Molly, did you want to say something? Unmuted.
No, I'm sorry. I just didn't turn my. I'm feeling quite exhausted after the elections, and probably not the best place to ask this question. Also, after 9 o'clock, I start dropping off. So I'm sorry. I'm going to do my very best to stay put.
Klina.
So I hope Make Votes Matter is a good phrase. That was decided on by quite a large vote of supporters quite a few years ago now. But I think thinking about the messaging is really important. We started a messaging process last year to that effect, because I think a lot of the words around electoral reform are not very helpful to the cause. So, for example, safe seats. Safe sounds good, but actually we're talking about a real problem when we talk about safe seats. So maybe they should be called stale seats or something like that. We've had a bit of a spanner in the works about continuing the messaging process, because I was off work unwell for quite a long time, but we are now looking to get that going again. And the idea is to reach out and do some quantitative getting people's views on different types of phrasing, and I'm talking about going outside of the electoral reform and democratic bubble to find out what really resonates with people. And I think then we do really need a catchy kind of phrase, or maybe it's multiple phrases. I personally think that the ecosystem approach, where you've got different people doing different parts of the picture really works well. So like I think that there probably does need to be progressive alliance work that Compass leads on. There probably needs to be democratic alliance work as well. There probably needs to be some people that kind of get the Tories out focus, and I'm really not anti-Tory. I think all voices need to be heard, but there's so much anger because the Tories are almost always in power, even though that's not the way that we vote, that's something that could be tapped into. But I've kind of digressed a bit about down this messaging path, but I think it's really important.
Yeah, Mary.
I just want to pick up something earlier in this conversation, which was about young people, education. I think that I worked before David Blunkett. There was Bernard Crick, and he was a great disciple of getting children caught on doing politics early, you know, finding out. And I've met so many people on the doorstep who say, I don't know enough to decide who to vote for. And you can enter a conversation, but you can't speak to everybody. We need to have votes at 16, and we need to recognise young people are part of our society. They voted in Scotland and Wales, and I think it's a really good issue because young people don't have the prejudices of older people. They think about issues in a different way, and often kinder.
I have got something to say, actually. Sorry, Anthea. Yeah, drawing on what Mary said, actually, young people are really getting excited about politics now, because I've always been the sort of really boring old weird aunt that did politics, you know, but now my two nieces are both really excited and like writing essays about me in school and things like this. So, you know, I think it is the climate issue, it is Greta Thunberg, there's an amazing mobilization of young people, and I think they are going to demand real democracy, and we need to mobilize them, not mobilize them, but use their energy, which I think is already tending in the right direction. And obviously giving votes at 16 is definitely a part of that. But another part of it is citizenship education, because people are completely unaware of what their vote is for and how they can use it. So my son's a doctor in Cambridge, so he's like in the brainy centre of the country, and yet when he came to vote, he accidentally voted for the Reform Party. I probably shouldn't say that, don't tell anybody that, but you know, because it was so complicated, the ballot and so on, 5 different papers to vote on, all different systems, none of this explained. So he just turns up in the polling station with 5 different forms there. And there hadn't been a single leaflet going through the door that wasn't from a political party, you know, a neutral leaflet just explaining what he would be voting for and how the different systems work. So, I mean, it's just abysmal. The whole system is wide open to manipulation and lies because people are simply unclear about how to use their vote. So obviously that's a job for not Ofcom, you know, for the Electoral Commission, but I think with the Tories, it's unlikely they'll be doing that job, but certainly citizenship education in schools and continuing citizenship education is something that's essential for a functioning democracy.
Yeah, very valid, very valid points indeed. We've got a question here saying, do independents feature in PR systems, or do they just get pushed out? Speaking from Froome, Adam Boyden.
Yes, hi, thank you.
Oh, no, oh, sorry. So would the panel like to address that, issue of what happens to independents?
That comes back to the point I was making earlier, that actually, I mean, when was the last time an independent was elected under this system? It was Martin Bell, wasn't it? Has there been one since then? Maybe somebody can think of another one.
Yeah, Richard Taylor, the hospital candidate.
Ah, he won, did he? Yeah. But, you know, we're sort of, it's on the fingers of one hand in our lifetimes, isn't it? So first past the post is a system for parties, so individuals and independents don't get a look in, and it would depend on the system that we chose, but yeah, it would be equally true, I think, in a PR system, that it would be very tough for independents. But as we've seen now with some of the independents, like the Morecambe Bay independents, or you know, the independents you have in Froome, actually the independents start to sort of coalesce, and that's actually how new parties are born. And you could certainly, if it was a regional list system or a regional top-up system, then you could imagine that independents might stand together as a list, and if the threshold was as low as 5% or even 7 or 8%, then they might well be able to get elected.
You're on mute, Anthea. Oh.
Yeah, Klina.
Thanks. So this is where we, if we are going to talk about independence and voting systems, then we kind of have to talk about voting systems a little bit. And systems like the single transferable vote, which are preferential, are better for independence than systems that use lists like the additional member system. It might be worth saying at this point, just because we've kind of avoided all of the systems conversation, just for those who don't know and would really like to, there's basically two ways of getting proportional representation, and that's either by having multiple member constituencies, which is often with a preferential system like single transferable vote, or you have single member constituencies with top-up lists like the additional member system that's used in Scotland, Wales and the London Assembly. And if you're having single member constituencies, it's equally as hard as currently under first past the post for independents to get elected. And then the lists come from parties, unless of course was just mentioned, you could have groups of independents on a list together. So because at that point, if you're really keen on independence, which many are, then maybe there's a lean towards the preferential systems.
Mary.
I went to East Devon recently, where the independent could win if people saw that she could win. And also, I think that more and more people are entering in politics where they think that, for instance, Labour or Conservative can't win. They're entering as independents. And so that's happening because we've got a move towards unitary authorities. And the lower tier is people are moving into there. And I say in the Southwest, there are lots of independents who are standing, whether they win or not. And usually people know what their politics is by what they say, but they're standing as independents. And the first past the post, for heaven's sake.
Thank you. This is a reiteration really of some of the issues that we've already covered, but it's still, I think it's still worth exploring a little bit further. Anna and Julian Andrews, whilst the concept of electoral reform is admirable, will it really happen anytime soon? It seems unlikely. So what's the immediate priority? Surely for us, it's to stop another Tory government at any cost as soon as possible. Simplistic, of course, but none of the opposition parties are going to be in government on their own. And then they go on to an opposition alliance must be the answer to stand just one candidate against the Tory. Paper candidates are just confusing to a poorly informed electorate. I think this is a problem we're going to keep coming back to, is that those of us who aren't party supporters just kind of begging you guys to just do something just this once to achieve that aim of not having Tories in power forever.
Well, I'm just going to say I agree, but it's a lot harder than you think.
Yeah.
And not just because Labour doesn't want to do it yet. Even if Labour came on board, it would still be incredibly difficult because everybody has a lot of vested interest. There's a deal to be done there, I think. And obviously I'm working hard for that and will continue to do so. And it is very popular. And I totally feel for you, Anthea, and everybody here who's in a marginal seat. It's just appalling. The system puts people under terrible psychological pressure, and it just shouldn't be that way.
Thank you. Yes, Tom.
I'd just like to reiterate, unfortunately, that it is going to be messy. There's not going to be a simple national agreement between the progressive parties to form an alliance either before or after the next general election. I don't think that's going to happen. And you know, so it is going to be down to individual decisions taken at a local level. Apart from anything else, a national decision that can't necessarily be delivered at a local level. If you have local parties that are absolutely adamant that their candidate, you know, they want their Liberal Democrat or they want their Labour or they want their Green candidate, the national party can say whatever it wants, but in a lot of parties, actually, you will still have a party candidate standing. And if they feel that strongly about it, they may stand as an independent instead. So I don't think there's going to be anything at a national level. It will be down to individual constituencies. It's not going to happen. It doesn't have the potential to happen in every single constituency, but there are constituencies where, you know, the numbers game is so clear and has been so consistently clear that if that relationship can be built up now, there is a strong chance that it doesn't need to be 650 constituencies. You know, it probably needs to happen in 50 constituencies. If it can happen in 50 constituencies, that might get a non-conservative government or a series of parties over the line after the next general election. And if we have built up a platform that includes climate change, the parties should all be able to agree, the progressive parties should be able to agree on that. If it can agree on electoral reform or democratic reforms, then you have a ready-made sort of recipe book that the parties can sit down and negotiate over after an election. I suppose the last thing I would say is that this is going to require people to accept that there are going to be imperfections. Now, I'd be interested to know, for instance, what the Green Party supporters think in Sheffield, where there is now an arrangement between the Labour Party and the Green Party to form the council there. I suspect there may be some Greens who feel that after what happened with the trees in Sheffield, that they're perhaps not that keen to be in an agreement with the Labour Party. But I hope they will bite their lips, accept that nothing is perfect and that you do need to make compromises. And there's no point in adopting a hardline purist position that says, you know, if the other party isn't willing to commit to 100% of what we want in our manifesto, then we're going to spit the dummy and we're going to insist on, for instance, putting up a candidate or opposing the joint candidate that others are hoping will emerge as the leading candidate in a particular constituency.
I just want to very quickly check something out with Tom here. Obviously, spit the dummy is a much more insulting metaphor to use than punching above your weight. I don't think we behaved in a childish or baby-like way. In fact, quite the reverse. But what I'm checking out, Tom, is you said that you don't think there can be a national arrangement, but you, obviously the Liberal Democrats were part of the Unite to Remain alliance, which was negotiated at a national level. So I'm just checking out whether you're saying there can't be a national agreement like Unite to Remain ever again, or whether you're saying we can't organise an arrangement that covers all 650 seats, because I would be a little bit more ambitious than 50 seats, but I think it does need to be a national negotiation. And as with Unite to Remain, the National Party recommends, but obviously with the Liberal Democrats and with the Greens, the local parties have the final say. And to me, what we're doing before the election is constitutional reform and an agreement to stand aside for each other. The policy discussions mostly will happen after the election on the basis of how many seats we actually win. So, you know, I mean, nobody's going to be purist before the election, but after the election, it will be as you negotiated as Liberal Democrats with the Tories, you know, on the basis of the power that you have, how much of your manifesto goes into the programme. So that's just standard stuff. It's what happens before the election that will be different this time. And I'm just checking out whether, when you say there'll be no national agreement and it has to be negotiated locally, you are rejecting the kind of proof of concept of Unite to Remain. Because obviously the more local you get, the harder it gets to share out the seats. That's the point. That's why Unite to Remain worked, because it was national and there were seats that other people didn't value as much that could be traded off.
Well, first of all, I wasn't suggesting the Green Party in Sheffield had spat the dummy. On the contrary, because they have gone into an agreement with the Labour Party, whereas there might, some within the Green Party may have had reservations over that tree issue. So actually what I was saying was the exact contrary.
Good, glad to hear it.
You suggested. In relation to, first of all, I'm not here as the spokesman of the Liberal Democrats, so I can't predict what the Liberal Democrats are going to do come the next general election. But I think the idea that there'll be a big national announcement, a big sort of fanfare that says the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and the Greens have agreed that at a national level that this is how we're going to carve out the 650 seats, that is what I'm saying is not going to happen. Okay. What I'm saying is there will be negotiations which will ensure that in certain seats in the country there can be an agreement. Whether it'll be candidate standing down to make way for a unique candidate, I don't know, or more an approach that says the other parties will simply back off. That will have to be the subject of those negotiations. That's what I'm saying.
But you acknowledge that it did happen with Unite to Remain.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Clearly there were seats where that happened, and that was effective.
Mary, you were next.
Yeah, I did. I think we need to have this common platform sort of thing in our mind, that we need to have each party putting forward these common policy areas in their manifesto, so it's obvious that they're going to say it. They don't need to agree in public, but what they could do is stop squabbling. I've noticed that on programs like Any Questions and Question Time, people are more likely to say I agree with. So there's Ed Davies saying I agree with somebody from the Labour Party or vice versa, and I think that goes down quite well, and can be translated to other places where you have opportunities to agree, like opposition days, like backbench legislation, like you know, where we're not all adversarial, but we know what we want. We want not to get rid of Tories from everyday politics, but this particular brand of Tory that's anti-democratic and moving in the opposite way from democracy. We do want to overturn them at the next general election, and we should have. So Layla Moran said this. She said people didn't say they were voting for the Liberal Democrats in her seat. They said Labour voters supporting Layla. And I think those local things, people will know in their locality how they get a non-Tory candidate. So in Cheltenham and Chippenham in this region, they're tried and tested in Bath, which irritates a lot of Labour people. So yeah, why can't we get some discussions? I think it has to happen at every level, and I think Cook McClellan made a lot of difference before '97.
Klina.
Thanks. I'd just like to go back to the question, and I heard in that it's really hard to get PR. It's not going to happen soon, so we just need to focus on stopping getting another Tory government, which means some kind of electoral cooperation. And first of all, I think that the first point on that is that if we say that we're not going to get PR, then that's certainly not going to help us get PR. And I think hope is really important, not just a kind of vague, oh, I'm hopeful, but like actually believing it's possible, looking at the facts and seeing that it's possible, and then taking the steps to get there. And I think that's really, really important. If we just assume we're going to end up, I think there's, it might be from the same people or person, we're going to be damned to have a Tory government for the foreseeable future, and all the opposition parties will be just that in perpetuity. Like, let's not create the future that we don't want. Let's focus on what we do want. The other really important thing about this is that if you're going to have electoral cooperation to get the Tories out, then it's really not worth doing that without the point, the end goal of improving our democracy. Because if we do succeed with this thing which we're talking about, which is really difficult, all the electoral cooperation, if we do get a government based on that, and we then don't implement electoral reform, then we have to game the system every single time. Whereas if the point is changing the voting system, we only have to do it once. So actually it's much easier to do this for the sake of PR than it is to do it for the sake of just not having the Tories next time. So let's keep sight of that.
I think you're quite right. And I also would like to stress that at West Country Buyers, you know, and we are not we're not anti-conservative, we're anti the Boris Johnson government and the Boris Johnson agenda, and very frightened about what's coming down the track if they're allowed to just get whatever they seem to have planned for us. And it's no accident he's meeting Viktor Orban on Friday, I'm sure. We've got a good...
add very briefly to what Klina said, and that is that you do need to, in my view, you do need to prepare the ground in advance. You need to have some areas, and democratic reform is a very good one, where the parties that you're hoping are going to form this government have agreement before you get there, because otherwise you're going to be confronted on day one with negotiations where no one knows where the other parties stand on a range of issues, and you're negotiating a Labour-led government is going to be incredibly difficult. So getting some sort of agreement in advance over as many issues, I would suggest, as possible, will certainly help the process. The last thing you would want is to then start those negotiations and realise that actually there was no common ground on anything, and your Labour-led coalition government then falls apart, and you then have alternative arrangements that will be potentially far less palatable.
Yeah, and also run the risk of frightening the electorate again, that this sort of thing can't happen. You can't. Coalitions are bad news, etc. On that sort of theme of everybody having representation and having a fair crack at it, Conor Olubi makes this very valid point. In 2015, UKIP achieved 4 million votes, 30% share, but only got 1 MP. The failure to give a voice to so many very likely contributed to the Brexit result. All voices, non-progressive, progressive et al., should be given a fair chance to be heard, as long as they're legally recognised parties. I don't suppose anybody's going to disagree with that.
Completely agree.
Agree.
Great. Yeah. Okay. Right. I'm just going down through the questions. Vote swapping. One of the things I want to ask is how many of you, I mean, it might seem a trivial observation, but I wonder if one of the key things that has to happen is to get rid of Westminster and turn it into a museum, as my colleague suggested, for failed democracy, and have a hemisphere, a modern, welcoming, open building, like the European. I mean, once you've been in the European Parliament, you can't imagine how anybody would ever want to go into Westminster ever again. Very hostile to women, very hostile to people who haven't been in the public school system, very antiquated, and very set up for pitched battles across the chamber. So what do you have views on where an alternative parliament might be and what it might look like, Tom?
Well, personally, I think Parliament should be where it is, and I don't favour moving it. But there was an opportunity, and there might still be an opportunity to try alternative arrangements if the Palace of Westminster restoration and renewal project ever goes ahead. Now, people may have objections to the idea of Parliament spending £5 billion or £6 billion on itself, renovating a building, but it is actually a significant fire risk at the moment, and we could find the whole building burning down pretty soon. And it is a World Heritage building, so I think that investment is worthwhile. And if the project goes ahead, there is going to be a second chamber that is going to be created, that is going to be, it could be tried in a completely different format. And in fact, that's what, when I was an MP, I was advocating, that it should do things like change the confrontational nature of the two benches facing each other. It should allow for an electronic voting system so that people didn't have to spend 15 minutes going round and round in circles to go through a division lobby. There is, if that project goes ahead and that second chamber is built, then there's still an opportunity to put pressure on whatever the government of the day might be, because this is not a project that's going to happen in the next couple of years. There might be still an opportunity to trial something different in that chamber while that chamber is being used, because the present chamber is being renovated. So you could test it, hopefully prove that it works without a shadow of a doubt. And then when Parliament moves back into the real chamber, then you adapt that to reflect the more positive, less confrontational style that you adopted in the temporary chamber that was being used while the other chamber was being renovated. So there is the potential to pursue that still.
Anybody else want to come in on that? Yes, Klina.
I love the idea of a museum of failed democracy. It could also be the museum of fake democracy. And yeah, let's have a circular parliament. I think that illustrates collaboration and equality. That's the norm, isn't it, in modern democracies?
Right. We've got a a question here, which actually we've dealt with at West Country Bylines with an article. Actually, isn't it actually the case that Labour's constitution says that every constituency must try to stand a candidate? This makes all talks of electoral pact rather pointless until that changes. We found that that is not the case. It's not true. It's a myth, an urban legend. Is that right, Mary?
I don't think there's a specific rule change that says Labour can't withdraw its candidates. What they do say is you can't vote for another party candidate. And so that makes it very difficult.
I thought it said you can't vote for another party candidate if you've got a candidate standing.
Oh, right. Well, I don't know. People have been through the rule book. I haven't, and I've got better things to do. What I think is it will take a rule change in the Labour Party, which takes people's energy away from arguing that Labour Party has really got to front up to PR this year. And if people go down the Clive Lewis and Polly Toynbee route, which is saying that we should have a rule change, we'll find that people who would normally have put a conference resolution in on PR will put it in a rule change, and the rule change won't go through. And we haven't got very much time. I keep on emphasizing, I don't think the Tories are going to want to grab hold of power forever, especially Boris doesn't want to be there. I mean, he gets much more money outside in show business. So I think that they will run for it as soon as we've got the boundaries in place, the voter ID in place, and the other things which are leading them to win. So unless we
Can I just check this, because it's actually really important. I mean, I think Anthea's right in the sense that there's nothing to say local parties must stand a candidate. But I think there is something that says if the local party doesn't choose a candidate, then the national party can impose one. So if there was a national agreement, then the national party would undertake to not impose candidates. So there's actually no rule blockage in the Labour Party to the kind of agreement I'm suggesting.
Yeah, that's our understanding, and we think it's just been used as
okay, but I don't think that rule change will go ahead. I mean,
I'm saying we don't. There's no need for a rule change, Mary. It's just that Labour needs to commit to not imposing candidates when there's been a local agreement or a national agreement that another party is more capable of beating the Tories.
Well, I was surprised at when Liberal Democrats and Green Party candidates withdrew, their national parties put people in, and I was quite surprised. Didn't that happen?
That can't happen
in Bristol and somewhere else.
That can't happen in our parties because the local party decides whether there's a candidate. That's true in the Liberal Democrats. It's true in the Green Party. The national party can't impose anything.
Yeah, did happen in Canterbury though, didn't it? Not with Greens. It was somebody, a guy, I can't remember who. A really decent bloke said, "I'm standing aside because I want to make sure the Labour candidate gets in," and then another candidate. I think it was Liberal Democrats actually.
Yeah, but the local party can say no.
Oh, the local party did it. Yes, right. Okay. Sorry. Excuse me. Anyway.
It's okay. It's important that we know these things. Really important.
Yeah. Rick Gale makes a very good point that party funding is also an important issue. All while one party can be far wealthier than the others, it's going to be very difficult to get completely fair elections. Would you like to comment on party funding, Klina?
Well, I'll just come back to the PR is the keystone meme that I keep pushing, which is that there are so many things that we need to fix with our democracy, and without having basic real democracy where seats match votes, it's really hard to do stuff like sort out party funding, like the interference of money in elections, all of the kind of things that the Conservatives are doing at the moment about saying that there has to be voter ID, which on the face of it seems sensible, but actually you look at the detail and you realise that it's kind of a bold-faced move to remove voters that would vote for other parties because they wouldn't be able to afford it, or it would put another kind of obstacle in their way of voting. So yeah, like, we need PR first and foremost so that we can bring about the other changes.
Yes, Tom.
Yes, I mean, the whole issue of party funding is one that we need to watch very carefully, if only because the Amanda Milling, the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, has threatened the Electoral Commission with abolition. And obviously the Electoral Commission is the body that looks at the national spend of political parties. And I think they've taken, Conservative Party have taken umbrage with the fact that the Electoral Commission investigated the Vote Leave campaign and found that they'd broken the law. And combined with the fact that the government have just agreed to increase the national spend that parties are allowed to spend in a general election, a national spend which probably only one political party is going to get close to meeting, and that will be the Conservative Party. Most of the other political parties will get absolutely nowhere near what the national legal spend is. And another area which is giving me increasing cause for concern is the proliferation of non-party campaign organisations that spring up a couple of weeks before an election campaign, then spend £50,000 or £60,000 on Facebook advertising and then disappear again. And these are organisations which, until they have formally registered as a non-party campaign organisation, they can receive funding from anywhere, and I mean anywhere in the world, which they don't have to account for. It's only once they have registered that they then have to account for money that has come into them as a campaign organisation since their registration. So any money they already had in their bank accounts, which could potentially have come from abroad, is something that they have to give no account of whatsoever. So, I mean, the whole area of party funding and election spending is something that we need to be very, very worried about, I would argue.
Indeed. Anybody else want to come in on that? I think it's pretty self-explanatory. We've got a question here by implication from Robert Thornton about whether mandatory voting should come in. Anybody want to comment on whether voting? Yes, Klina.
Yeah, I can do that. Oh, sorry, go Klina.
Okay.
So my personal view is absolutely not mandatory voting. I don't believe in forcing people to do things. I believe in making the things worthwhile to do. And in this case, obviously about voting, it needs to be worth people's time to vote. If they know their vote's going to be wasted, then they're far less likely to vote. So let's make it worthwhile. Obviously there are countries where they do this and it does increase turnout, but PR also increases turnout. So I'd prefer to keep democracy as something that we do voluntarily, and we have the education to understand that it's important, and some would say it's a duty, but that we're not actually forcing people to do things.
Margaret, Mary, you were going to say
yeah,
something?
no, we have discussed this in Labour campaign for electoral reform. We're sort of split two ways, and a lot of people who are against proportional representation in the Labour Party think compulsory voting is the answer. When the Plant Commission came up with various non-PR suggestions that it did with Jeff Rooker, now Lord Rooker, they decided that we ought to register our votes, our political preference, just in the same way as we register births and marriages and deaths. And you know, we should see as a civic duty of citizens to say what we think. And if we think, you know, they're all a waste of space, then put up yourself or have some, but get engaged. And picking up on what Klina said at the beginning about what democracy means, the people in ancient Athens who didn't go to and engage in the debate. Of course, they were all men. They weren't slaves and they weren't women, but they called it democracy because the demos was the men. The people who didn't engage in that discussion about whatever they were going to say when they cast their cephos, which was a stone, which has become our cephology, our vote, they were called idiotis, which meant that they were individuals and they were keeping away from joining in with people. And that became our word idiot. So I think that people who don't involve themselves in politics are idiots. And I think that isn't the way to approach them, but they ought to be politics has to be more interesting. It has to be more listening. It has to be more about finding a consensus, about agreement. And I believe that, the politics can be caught through the way you treat your own children, and whether you listen to them, whether you give them a platform to say what they think. And it goes all the way through society, in schools and in businesses. I've just read Varoufakis, and he doesn't believe in hierarchy, and neither do I. I think hierarchy is the enemy of democracy. The only time you are equal to everybody is when you vote. And of course, if you don't vote, you're not equal to anything. So voting is important.
I can see a very interesting voter incentivization strategy based on "Are you an idiot?"
Yes, that's what I say when I go into schools.
When I worry about voting, I don't worry about making voting mandatory. I worry about the people who are not on the electoral register who should be, and are losing their opportunity to vote. And I worry about, I think Mary was referring to it earlier, the voter suppression measures that the government are promoting, which will ensure that many people who are eligible to vote will find when they turn up that in fact they're not, because they won't have the necessary form of identification. So I think that is a much greater priority in my mind than measures to enforce voting, which would not be terribly liberal in any case.
Totally agree with Klina and Tom, but I just wanted to remind Mary that actually we aren't all equal when we go to vote, because those of us in marginal constituencies, our votes are worth hundreds of times the weight of people in the stale, rotten boroughs.
Of course.
Sorry, as we sort of head towards a close, I think people on this call obviously care passionately about democracy and the state that it's in, and want to get on and do something. I'm sure a lot of us actually want to do so. Obviously, we're limited as to what we can do in terms of being out on the street or demonstrating at the moment. And if Priti Patel has her way, we'll never be doing that again in a hurry. But I think one of the questions we've had is, can we at least coalesce around some empowering slogan? And somebody's, obviously make votes matter. A lot of people think that's very, very powerful. We've had quite a lot of comments on the chat of that. We've also had hashtag Democratic Alliance. Do we go for that? And or empower your vote. And I think it would be nice to leave everybody with a sort of message as to what they can do to try and make electoral reform a reality, and how we go forward from here and get the message out.
Well, I'd just like to add another potential slogan, and starting off by talking about take back control, because whilst everyone always bangs on about how brilliant that was, actually every single part of it is wrong. So you don't want to take from everyone else, you want to share. If you're a Democrat, you can't take back because we never had it, so we can't take it back. And control isn't right either. It's not about controlling others under you. It's about listening and making decisions together. So I think a nice alternative to that is equal power now. That's also an easy chant. So that's my offering for the slogans. And in terms of what people can actually do to make a change, they can make some noise on the 17th of July. So I shared the link in the chat earlier. I'll share it again to join up to Make Votes Matter, so you get our emails, and then you'll find out all about this exciting, massive grassroots action that's going to be happening all over the country in mid-July, the day before my birthday.
Excellent. Right.
Can I
Thank you,
chip
Molly.
in? Yeah. So I think actually we're in a very exciting time, because both the main parties are quite challenged by what's going on. It doesn't show as much with the Tories, but the way that these extremists that are the current government are sort of leading the Tories actually has alienated a lot of their voters. I mean, we as Greens did really well in quite a few Tory areas, including here, because Conservative voters were happy to have an alternative that they felt comfortable with. And I think that is the point. It's like actually driving people into their ghettos isn't helpful. And I think this is where I'm going to agree with what Klina said earlier, which is people vote. I don't agree with Conservatives. I hardly agree with any of their policies at all. But I know a lot of people who vote Conservative who are really decent people. And I think one of the things we have to do is to, you know, be open to Conservative voters, because we need to get them across to us if we're going to stop there being another Tory government. So pushing them back into a ghetto all the time and making out that they've made a mistake or they're evil or they have bad values or something for voting Conservative is actually making us harder for us to win the next election. So perhaps my advice would be, and I'm not saying I'll necessarily follow this myself, but befriend a Tory and persuade them to change the way they're voting. It's the most powerful thing we can all do.
I think you're quite. I think there must be thousands of disenfranchised Conservative voters, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands.
Voters actually want PR as well from polling. So yeah, let's remember that. And there are Tories in the Alliance for PR. So let's keep it broad. Absolutely.
Mary.
Yeah, I was going to say that I lived in York for 2 years, and I went to London, and I talked to people on trains. People often warn people to avoid me, but what I found was a lot of Tories from Darlington and from Newcastle and from Durham, and they were disenfranchised and worried about it. So, you know, good luck for Klina. I don't need to do Tories, but if she does, that's fine by me. I think we ought to have a national narrative like the Daily Mirror is doing, and it gets people to sign up and say what they believe, and then pairs them for completely opposite views. So there was a lot of Remain and Leave people, but people who were fishermen and hairdressers, you know, that we need to talk to people who differ from ourselves, because the most exciting thing about politics is you meet people who don't agree with you, not people who do agree with you. That's rather boring. That's what the SNP is, boring at the moment. And I believe that one of the arguments we could have, one of the slogans we could have, is last election fought under first past the post. It's a bit long, but we can play with that. And the other thing is, I really like going back to the Chartists, the suffragettes, to Selma, Alabama, South Africa, and looking at the vote as how important it is as a symbol of democracy. And we've let it degrade itself. And I want to bring back enfranchisement and making votes count, making votes matter. Is really good to say and believe that we should have. When I say equal votes, I don't mean equal influence. I mean, because of first past the post, that's impossible. What I want is for people to feel that they have a say, that this is their voice, this is their opportunity to say what they think other people in society might agree with and find consensus.
Brilliant, thank you.
Tom, did you want?
Yes, just to add that I would like to sort of rip off Make Votes Matter slogan and widen it or broaden it slightly to just to change it to Make Democracy Matter, because it's not just about votes, but it's about the wider democratic agenda and the challenges that it faces. But I found this uplifting, and I think there is these sorts of discussions are what can help create the circumstances in which alliances at a local level or indeed at a national level are going to be possible. And the need for one has certainly never been greater. And Mary's referred a number of times to the Cook-McLennan initiative. That is the sort of atmosphere that we need to try to recreate very quickly in anticipation of a general election, which won't be in 2024, might be in 2023, might even be in 2022. So we need to get this working now, because we have a very short time frame in which to achieve it.
Thank you very much. I think for our part at West Country Barnes, we're going to keep running stories as we did yesterday about the democratic deficit in Devon and just getting people engaged and involved. And I would strongly recommend, as a campaigner with another hat on, that if you're wearing something, a badge or carrying a bag or something that says something like Make Votes Matter or Empower Your Vote or whatever, you do start conversations, and once we're out and about again, people will stop you and say, why have you got that, and why are you interested in that, and why are you campaigning in that? And I think that's an important thing for the grassroots to make their position clear and get stuck in. I'm going to hand over to Rick, who's just going to say some final words. And I would just say thank you all very, very much. Please read West Country Bylines, obviously, and share it widely. You are our distribution network, and we are trying to break out beyond the bubble of people who agree with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthea. And well, thank you very much, everyone. It's been a bit of a marathon, hasn't it? I've got three thoughts in my mind at the moment. I went to a Labour for a New Democracy event a couple of weeks ago, which was called It's Bloody Complicated. And that's something that's very clear when we have discussions like this evening. I thought at various times we were all going to fall out on the panel there, but then towards the end, we all came to a consensus, and that's how good debate should work. And I'm glad we did that. The second thing I've been thinking that I learned earlier today is that, and it's about vested interest really. Apparently Gordon Brown's cabinet was the only one there's ever been in this country that had no old Etonians on it. Isn't that a thought, eh? In all those hundreds of years. And the third thought I had was, and again, I think this echoes something that Klina said, is this is going to be a big hill to climb. It's a big battle, but it's a battle we only have to win once, because once PR is in place, no one's ever going to get the kind of majority they need to take it away from us again. So it's a battle we need to fight collectively, and we need to fight it for our children and our grandchildren, not just for ourselves. So I think it's very important. So just finally, thank you very, very much to the panel. It's been a long and grueling evening, and you have done us proud. And thank you to all those people who've stuck it out till the bitter end, nearly 75 of you, look. And thank you to Anthea for organising it, or allowing it to be organised this evening. So enjoy the rest of your evening, everybody, and thank you very much for coming, and please keep up the fight.
Yeah, thank you, and look out for our next event in a month's time. We'll be publicising that shortly. Bye everybody, good night, and thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you everyone.